So a while back I built a couch, and I did record it, and there is a video of it. And eventually it might make it onto this channel when I finally get around to making the arms and finishing the back cushions. It's only been half a year. But after making the couch and putting it in place, I really wanted a little coffee table to go with it. And in my mind I had a really good idea of what it was going to look like. It's going to have this sort of kidney-shaped top with angled legs that would come off at 45-degree angles, and it was going to have a shelf, although I wasn't 100% sure if I was going to have the shelf or not. But I had a good idea what it was going to look like. I just had absolutely no idea how to actually put it together. I knew that I needed a frame to connect the top with the legs, so that was where I started. And initially I had a hard time deciding how big the frame should be. I wanted the legs to be set back under the top quite a bit, but I also didn't want to make the frame so small that there wasn't enough support. I ended up going kind of small, hoping that the tops of the legs would also provide additional support. And to attach the frame, I wanted to use oak dowels, but I only had 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch dowels, which were both too large and too small. So I ended up taking the 1/2 inch dowel and reducing it down to about 3/8, which felt pretty good for the size of the frame. And because I wanted the legs set at 45 degrees, I mitered the corners of the frame, ensuring there would be a large enough surface for the legs to set against. Then I figured a good position to set the dowels and drilled them on the drill press. For the shorter sides, which needed to be drilled into the end grain, I set some tape over them to make it easier to see the pencil marks. And then I just drilled those on the drill press as well because they were short enough. Assembling the frame was pretty straightforward. I just glued the dowels in place, joined the 4 pieces together, and left it clamped overnight. My plan for attaching the legs was to bolt through the frame into some threaded inserts at the tops of the legs. So for the bolts to work, I needed an inner surface that was parallel to my miters. So I cut some small wedges, which I then glued to the inside corners. And in retrospect, I kind of wish that I had tried to get the grain a little bit more parallel to the angle, just so that when pressure is applied, they're less likely to split. But I haven't had a problem with it so far. While I was waiting for the frame to glue up, I moved on to the legs. I wanted these to also be angled off the frame as well as being tapered. After figuring out what would look best to me visually, I adapted the dimensions of some rough 3D models to fit the boards that I had available. And initially, I made these a little bit thicker than I liked, and I ended up cutting them down a bit once I had a better idea of how they would look. I also made them slightly longer than I expected to need, just so that I would have enough to cut it down and get the height where I wanted it once I, again, had a better idea of how it was all going to look. After all the measuring and marking, I rough cut them by hand on the bandsaw, and I did my best to square up the connection point where the legs would meet the frame. Since the legs were cut freehanded, they were all a little bit different. I did keep one of my edges unmodified so that it would serve as a reference. To get them all as equally matched as I could, I set that reference point on a flat surface, clamped all 4 of the legs together, and sanded them as one. With the frame glued up, I marked the centers of the mitered corners for the locations of the bolt holes, and in an attempt to drill squarely through the frame, I did what I often do, and I made a guide block out of a piece of wood, which I then clamped to the surface while I was drilling through. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, that didn't work particularly well this time, and I ended up having to re-drill the holes to sort of widen them and re-angle them later on. To determine where to drill the pilot holes for the threaded inserts, I set a brad point drill bit through the frame and then just set the legs in place upside down and used the drill bit as a sort of transfer punch. I kind of got tired of setting up guide blocks and decided to just freehand them, which went just fine, actually. The threaded inserts that I use just screw into place with a hex wrench. With a pilot hole of 9mm, they tend to cut threads really easily. And when I use these threaded inserts now, I add some wood glue to the threads, which helps lock them in place better so they don't accidentally turn. And also I figure it'll help strengthen the wood grain around the threads. Now is the first time I actually got to see the frame and the legs together, and I was really disappointed. It felt so flimsy, and I was really doubting whether or not this would even work. Obviously, a missing component was having the top in place, which would have set flush against the legs and further stabilized them, but I still wasn't really sure if that was going to be enough, but I decided to keep going, hoping that it would work out. But once I could see it together, I realized right away that the legs were way too chunky looking, so I brought them in a bit on either side from the bottom, tapering them up to the full width near the top. And to cut the taper into them, I just used my benchtop sander, freehanding it with the sanding disc. And with those done, I cut some quick chamfers along their edges, giving them a finished and more rounded appearance. Finally, I got to move on to the tabletop, and I think just due to the hecticness and the fact that I was rushing this project, and also that this glue up was a pretty big effort, I ended up not recording it. But like every other part of this table, the top was made from 2x4s, basic construction lumber. To get the boards to the right thickness, I cut them down on the table saw beforehand, and then I had to glue 5 of them together, which I did using half-inch oak dowels in between the boards, to get a thickness that I thought would be good for the tabletop. But after a lot of cleanup, I tried sketching out the shape I wanted, and that was when I realized they're just a little bit thinner than I would like. So I ended up gluing an additional board, this time recording it so you can see how I did the rest. The only difference being that I used a faster setting glue this time, just out of impatience. And with the extra board, I was able to get a shape that I liked a lot more. So then I roughly cut it out using a jigsaw, and I figured I would try using my nifty little oscillating sander to clean up the edges. It probably wasn't the fastest option, and I didn't manage to get it quite as nice as I would have preferred, but it did the job. I wanted the top to be on the thicker side, so I cut it to be about an inch thick, which ended up being a little bit too thick visually. So to counter that, I cut a large chamfer on the bottom edge, and I would have preferred a wider, more shallow angle, but the best option I had was a standard 45-degree router bit. I think it ended up looking really nice anyway, and the top I just gave a quick round over. Because I was trying to make the most use of the lumber that I had, I didn't have enough full-length boards to build the entire top, so I had to join a couple at some points. I didn't really get them clamped together as nicely as I would have preferred. I tried patching them with a bit of sawdust, but they never quite cleaned up that well. It actually took me a bit to find the best way to mount the frame onto the tabletop. Originally I was just going to put it along a center line, but that ended up not looking that great with the legs, so I ended up kind of tilting it slightly at an angle. And for this part, I also got lazy and I just attached the frame directly with countersunk screws. It really needed to be counterbored with widened holes to allow for wood movement, but I forgot to go back and do this later, so I'll add it to my list. Honestly, it'll probably be fine as it is, but it would be good to go back and do it properly. All I would need to do is run a brad point drill bit in the holes and replace the screws with truss-headed ones. With the top and the frame connected, I had a much clearer view of how the legs were fitting, and they needed some adjusting to get them to sit perfectly, which wasn't much work. You can see how much I had to correct some of the holes from earlier. At least they covered nicely with some washers. No one will ever know, except, well, everyone watching this right now. With that, the table is finally a table. The bottoms of the legs did also need a bit of re-angling, which was also pretty simple. I just tapped them on the sanding disc until they sat flush on the table. At this point, looking at it, I could tell I really wanted the shelf. It seemed wasteful to not add it. And while the table did feel much more stable, being better fitted with the top, there still wasn't a lot of support keeping the legs from twisting. I figured adding a shelf would fix that and strengthen the whole table a lot more. To build the shelf support, I just gradually tweaked the angles by eye on my disc sander until it fit nicely. I also had a lot of concern here in how thin my shelf supports were. I really didn't want the frame to be visible, but I wasn't sure how reliable this thin of a frame would be. As always though, I figured I'd go with it and see how it ended up, and I could always redo it if I needed. Now, like the upper frame, I planned to bolt the shelf into the legs, which meant I needed some wedges to get a parallel edge. What I neglected to realize though was that because the legs were angled, the wedge would need to be very thin. That really didn't contribute to my confidence about the strength of the shelf frame. I could already tell just by wedging the frame in that it made the entire table much stronger. I ended up drilling the bolt holes a little bit lower to have more material above them, and in doing so neglected to realize how much of an angle there was, which meant that the bolts would protrude from the bottom. Well. And now that I had the frame ready, all I needed to do was level it and then transfer the centers of the holes with a drill bit to get the pilot hole for the threaded inserts in the legs. To drill the pilots in the angled legs, I just countered the angle by setting one leg on top of another on the drill press. And even though the frame was very thin, the entire assembly felt really strong. If I was doing this again though, I would have made the frame a lot beefier. I can say, having used this for nearly half a year now and having quite a bit of things on that bottom shelf, it has never given me an issue. To help the shelf fit in aesthetically, I decided to give the edge a bit of a curve. I fine-tuned the fit by removing one of the legs and just sneaking up on the angles, again with the disc sander. This part went a lot faster than I expected, but maybe I just got lucky. Gave both the top and the bottom edges of the shelf a bit of a round over, and at this point, it was ready for finishing. I wanted the couch and this table to maintain a lighter tone, so I kept it simple and just used some water-based polyurethane. And in the end, I gotta say, I was surprised by several things. One, that I actually did manage to finish this in about a week. That I managed to build this entirely from basic 2x4 construction lumber. That it only cost about $15 in materials. That it ended up being really sturdy despite its simple design. And finally, that it looked exactly like I imagined, and I really like how it turned out. So in closing, this was a fun and satisfying project, and at the end I got the exact table that I wanted. You'll have to wait until I finally finish the couch to see them together, so look forward to that in 7 years. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to support me or see more details including a full write-up of this build, I am working on setting up a Patreon. I have many more projects and videos in the works, and finally getting to this point has been a goal that I've worked towards for years, though I didn't expect this to be the first video I uploaded. Right now I'm at a major turning point in my life, and I deeply appreciate any support or feedback that you guys may have. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing this come together, and I hope that you'll stop by in the future to see some much more complicated projects.